Hi, I'm Haley Clatterbuck from the Philosophy Department at the University of Rochester, and I'm here to discuss my paper that just came out in Mind and Language, Chimpanzee Mind Reading and the Value of Parsimonious Mental Models. I'd like to thank Robert and the rest of the Brains blog for this opportunity. I'd especially like to thank Cameron Buckner, Shannon Spalding, and Jennifer Vonk for agreeing to comment on the paper. You can find their commentaries below and my responses as well. So in this short video, I'm going to give an introduction to the logical problem, an influential argument in comparative psychology, that addresses the question of whether we can experimentally confirm the mind-reading hypothesis, the hypothesis that other animals are capable of representing and reasoning about the mental states of others. Then I'm going to briefly explain one attempt to respond to this problem from Elliot Sober, and I'm going to argue that his argument doesn't adequately rebut the logical problem. However, I do think that we can use some of the insights of Sober's argument to shed light on the adaptive value of mind reading, what the function of mind reading is in a cognitive system. So after presenting this hypothesis about the function of mind reading, I'm going to conclude by explaining some of the doubts I have about this proposal in order to generate discussion in the comments. Okay, so the debate in question I'm weighing in on regards the status of the mind-reading hypothesis. Now, this debate has reached something of a decade-long impasse, with one side claiming that we have strong experimental evidence that confirms the mind-reading hypothesis, and the other side claiming that the experiments that have been cited as evidence do not, and actually could not constitute evidence for the mind-reading hypothesis. So what are the experiments in question? So the state of the science has progressed significantly since then, but I'm going to focus on what have been called the breakthrough experiments. The experiments that its proponents say for the first time established that chimpanzees were capable of mind reading. So these experiments were a set of food competition experiments performed by Brian Hare and his colleagues in 2000 and 2001, and here's the basic setup. So they consisted of a central arena. On one side, there was a subordinate chimp, and the other side, there was a dominant. And in the arena, there were two food items. One of them was out in the open, and thus visible to both chimps. And another one was behind a barrier from the dominant, but could be seen by the subordinate. So the subordinate was given a head start, and it could see the dominant on the other side of the arena. And they observed that the subordinate preferred to go for the food item that was concealed by the barrier, namely the one that the dominant could not have seen. So several variations of the experiment were run. So the opaque barrier was replaced by a transparent barrier. There were iterations where the dominant's back was turned, so on and so forth. And in every case, the subordinate was observed to preferentially approach the food item that the dominant had not seen, and was indifferent in cases in which the dominant had seen both or neither. So how should we interpret these results? So Hare, Tomasello, and Call, and others conclude that such experiments are evidence that the subordinate reasoned about what the dominant could and could not see, and on the basis of that mental state attribution, predicted what it would do, and that's what guided the subordinate's behavior. So it reasoned like, well, if the food is behind a barrier, the dominant can't see it, and if the dominant can't see it, then I'm in the clear. It won't wallet me for going for the food. However, the logical problem was raised as an attack on the claim that these experiments provided evidence for the mind-reading hypothesis. So this is a problem that was raised by Pavanelli, Vonk, Penn, and their colleagues, and as I reconstructed, the argument has two parts. So the first part says that for any purported instance of mind reading in such experiments, a purely behavior reading hypothesis can be constructed that will explain the observed data just as well. So the behavior reading hypothesis posits that the chimp did not reason about the mental states of the dominant, but merely its observable cues and resultant observable behaviors. So the second part of the logical problem says that this competing behavior reading hypothesis ought to be preferred on the grounds that it's more parsimonious. So I'll explain these two in turn. So the first part, the basic idea is this. So on the mind-reading hypothesis, it posits that the subordinate must have formed a belief about certain observable cues of the experiment of the dominant, from which it inferred that the dominant would be in some mental state. So, for example, if the dominant is separated by an opaque barrier from the food, he cannot see it. And then on the basis of this mental state attribution, the subordinate infers that the dominant will perform some behavior. So if the dominant cannot see the food, he will not punish me for grabbing it. However, it seems like we can also explain the chimp's behavior by positing that it had that very same belief about the observable cues of the dominant, and on the basis of that belief alone, inferred the resultant behavior of the dominant. So, in essence, the behavior reading hypothesis cuts out the middleman, right? It says, oh, it believed that there was an opaque barrier between the food and the dominant, and maybe based on a contingency that it had learned between that and behaviors of dominance in those settings, inferred what the dominant would do. So the upshot, I think, is that there are mind reading and behavior reading hypotheses that fit the data equally well, and I'll grant that for the sake of argument. So the second part of the logical problem says that the behavior reading hypothesis is simpler, so it attributes fewer beliefs to the subordinate and only beliefs about observables, so it ought to be favored on those grounds. As Pavanelli and Vank put it, there's no sense in which a system that makes inferences about behavioral concepts alone provides a less parsimonious account of behavior than a system that must make all of those same inferences, plus generate inferences about mental states. So as I see it, there are sort of two main sort of ramifications of this argument. It raises two main questions. Now, the first is the one that Pavanelli, Vank, and their colleagues explicitly focus on. And it's an epistemic challenge for the mind reading hypothesis. So given that both hypotheses can fit the data equally well, how could we ever know whether a chimpanzee was a mind reader? What type of experiment would tell between these two hypotheses? That was the original intended point of the logical problem. However, I think there's a second challenge that the logical problem raises, and this regards the adaptive epistemic function of mind reading. So given that a perhaps ideal behavior reader in these experiments can do just as well as a mind reader, what does mind reading add to our predictive abilities? As Pavanelli and Vank put it, it's unclear what the unique causal work of mind reading is. So if it's the case that if in order to mind read, a subject must already possess a large store of beliefs about the contingencies that hold among observables, which would suffice all by themselves for predictive purposes, then mind reading starts to look superfluous. And I think this argument can be extended to theoretical beliefs more generally. And this is no accident. The logical problem is very, very similar to an argument from the philosophy of science, Hempel's theoretician's dilemma, which purports to show that theories can be dispensed with altogether. On the other hand, Pavanelli, Vank, and colleagues have argued that theoretical capacity, like mind reading, sort of was the unique innovation in human lineage that explains all of our exceptional cognitive abilities. And if that's right, then theorizing and mind reading must play some tremendously powerful adaptive role. So I take it there are two tasks in responding to the logical problem. The first is how could we know whether something was a mind reader? And second, what is the function of mind reading? So I'm going to turn to an argument from Elliot Sober that tries to give an answer to the first epistemic challenge, and I don't think it works. But I think it does shed light on the other project, what the adaptive function of mind reading is. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of details in Sober's argument because it's complicated, but here's the gist. In a 2009 article, Sober disputes the claim that the behavior reading hypothesis is necessarily more parsimonious than the mind reading hypothesis. He shows that in some cases, models of chimp behavior that attribute mind reading beliefs to them will be simpler, and further, simpler in a way that matters epistemically. The idea is as follows. Consider the models that we might use to describe and predict the behavior of chimpanzees in hares experiments. When we consider just a single iteration of the experiment, each of the behavior reading and mind reading models can model the chimp's behavior using just two parameters. For the mind reading hypothesis, whether or not the subordinate believed that the dominant saw the food, and for the behavior reading hypothesis, whether or not the subordinate believed there was a barrier between the dominant and the food. However, when we turn to multiple versions of the experiment, we try to model them all together, the number of parameters that the behavior reading hypothesis needs to model the chimp's behavior just explodes. because they need to use separate parameters for every different experimental context. On the other hand, Sober argues, the mind reading hypothesis requires just the same two parameters. So the mind reading hypothesis is simpler in that it unites all of these cases under a single variable, and this reduces the number of adjustable parameters in the model. So why is this relevant? Let's grant that we are comparing two models of chimp behavior that fit the data equally well, one of which requires many more parameters than the other to do so. So Sober applies a model selection criterion from Akaike, which shows that the expected predictive accuracy of a model is a function of both its fit to the data and a penalty for a number of adjustable parameters it contains. So it shows how predictive accuracy, when applied to new data, is a trade-off between the fit of the model and how complex it is. And we can get an intuitive handle on how this is supposed to work by considering the two challenges of modeling. So you want your model to pick up on all the genuine regularities in the data, the signal, without overfitting to spurious regularities, the noise, which will lead to inaccuracy if projected. So models with more parameters generally fit the data better, but they'll often fit it too well, and this will lead to an expected decrease in predictive accuracy. Okay, so where are we? So the behavior reading hypothesis and mind reading hypothesis allow us to construct models that fit the data equally well. However, the mind reading hypothesis contains fewer adjustable parameters and therefore is expected to be more accurate. And according to Sober, this gives us some reason to prefer the mind reading hypothesis in virtue of its simplicity. So in the paper, I raised some complications for Sober's application of AIC to this case, but essentially the point is correct, that the mind reading model allows us to predict chimp behavior better than the behavior reading model. However, I don't think this is the point that matters for the debate at hand. Sober's argument shows merely that the mind reading models that we construct to predict the subordinate chimp's behavior will be more predictably accurate when they contain mind reading variables. However, the predictive accuracy of the mind reading model, I argue, does not mean that the model is likely to be true. Sort of from this instrumentalist value, we can't make the realist inference that we really care about here. So in general, the argument from the predictive accuracy of a model to its truth is that the model wouldn't make accurate predictions unless it were true. But in this case, I think we should doubt that claim for a couple of reasons. And the first, which is pointed out by Pavanelli and others, is that humans find it massively heuristically valuable to explain the behavior of lots of things, even things without minds, in terms of folk psychology. And it's a mistake to think that every time that facilitates our predictive abilities, that it's likely to be true, literally true. Furthermore, AIC, the model selection criterion in question, is explicitly instrumentalist. It often delivers a result that literally false, but simpler theories will be more accurate. So I argue that Sober's model selection argument doesn't address the epistemic question after all. It doesn't give us a reason to favor the mind reading hypothesis. However, I suggest that it can indirectly shed light on the question of the function that mind reading plays. Even if we accept the premise of the logical problem that mind reading requires the knowledge of behavioral contingencies that would suffice for prediction all by themselves. I think the basic idea is that when we turn our attention from the models that we construct of chimp behavior to the models that chimps construct in their heads of chimp behavior, we can apply the same type of reasoning and see that the mind-reading mental models that chimps have will contain fewer adjustable parameters and therefore be more predictably accurate. We can see that adding variables representing the mental states of others simplifies models. Further, given that the chimp's social and physical environment is noisy and that there's probably a strong selective pressure to accurately predict the behavior of conspecifics as well as factors in the physical world, this might be an importantly adaptive function. So thus, even if we accept the logical problem, mind reading might play a unique role over and above the behavioral contingencies alone. So this suggestion, I admit, is speculative and it rests on some questionable assumptions, but I just want to sort of point to the fact that I think that this is the type of question we should be asking in light of the logical problem. what is the function of mind reading or other theoretical beliefs, such that a mind reader will behave in ways that a behavior reader will not, and then we can use these functions to design new tests for mind reading capacities. So, as promised, I'm going to conclude with some worries I have about this suggested hypothesis. So the first is, does it move things forward epistemically? Does it solve the epistemic logical problem? Here's how it would work, I guess, right? So if increased predictive accuracy is evidence for mind reading, we could test whether, right, chimps were more accurate. But to do this, we would need a baseline level of accuracy for behavior readers, and this is precisely what we don't know yet. Which are the mind readers, which are the behavior readers? That's a problem. Second, with respect to whether it's an answer to what the function of mind reading is, I'm worried about that as well. So it seems that this would just allow you to do the same things predictably, but just more accurately. Whereas you might think that the adaptive role of mind reading, if any, is to expand the types of cognition that their users are capable of, rather than doing the same old things, but faster and more accurately. And lastly, as I pointed out in the paper, there are also intervening behavior reading variables that can similarly simplify mental models. And so if that's the case, this won't be a unique function of mind reading. All right, so I am looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that in the comments. I hope you enjoy the paper. Thanks for watching, and yeah.